Charles, because you back there when folk come in, they'll notice it on this side. Well, I don't want to take any more time from this presentation. Those of you who come to the Tuesday evening Bible class, you know, we're examining Africans who shaped our faith, and we're using the book by Jeremiah Wright, Africans who shaped our faith. The thing I want to point out is I've lifted up the bibliography of the book, which is extensive, and I want to mention that several of the books Dr. Rashidi has edited or co-edited, and so without any further ado, we have a scholar without peer among us, and we thank God for him. So put your hands together for Dr. Runoko Rashidi.
Thank you very much, Pastor. Where's the beautiful young lady that was so helpful in getting this together? Is she gone? Give her a round of applause. See, when you get old like me, you can barely text. And literally, I've just started to text within the last few months, so people think I'm crazy, and they're probably right. Now, I'm very happy to be here. Pastor has invited me here about 4 or 5 times now. And he has a lot of faith in me. And I think that he has a lot of faith in what we're trying to do. All right. And this is a lot of it right here. It's breaking a psychological chain in terms of the way we are programmed. Now, I consider this a continuation of Black History Month. I also want to acknowledge our executive minister who patiently picked me up at the Oriental Institute, took me to Starbucks, and drove me here. Please give him a round of applause. Because it really does take a village. It really does. Nobody can do this by themselves. I don't care how powerful they are, I think they are. Now, I consider this a continuation of Black History Month. Black History Month, I guess, is officially our time to acknowledge the past, the stony road we've trod, celebrate in a sense, give thanks. But 28 and a quarter days is not a very long period of time. And we're handicapped by 2 things, I believe. One is we act as though, when I say we, I'm speaking very generally, as though we're the only Black people in the world, that African Americans are somehow isolated from other Black people around the world, which is certainly not true. And number 2, we almost always start with slavery. So we focus so much on Dr. King and Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. Not that they weren't great people, but that's not the totality of our history. I began last month in Washington, D.C., and I'll be going back in a few days. You know, didn't want to go, but people felt that it was important that I go see the new National African American Museum. Has anybody seen it? It is essentially a slavery museum. There's a little tiny bit, I think, about Nigeria, just to start with, hardly nothing. And then the whole ground floor is about slavery. Now, not that slavery is not important, don't get me wrong. We should never minimize the suffering of our ancestors. But we didn't start there. When white people talk about their history, they're going to start with the Greeks and the Romans. You might not know who they are, but you've heard the names of Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar and Aristotle and Plato. They weren't slaves. But when it comes to your history and my history, we are compelled to start with Chicken George at our lowest point in history. So if you start that way, it's difficult in many cases to move beyond that. So that's what this first one is right here. Our history did not begin in chains and not end in chains. Now, some of the images that I'm going to show you and some of the themes that I'm going to address, I've talked about here in this very institution on a number of occasions. What I'll try to do, since I think, how many of y'all have seen me speak here before? Okay, oh, my goodness. You want to do the presentation? You want to come and sit? Well, I'll try to at least show you some new images and emphasize some of those same themes. about why history is important. Somebody said it, a youngster. I mean, it's interesting that I've been in situations of late where the young people, in many ways, have kind of led the way. I was in Washington, D.C. last Saturday, and somebody was paraphrasing me or attempting to paraphrase something that I say all the time. What I say is this, you may have heard me say this before. What you do for yourself depends on what you think of yourself. And what you think of yourself depends on what you know of yourself. And what you know of yourself depends on what you have been told. Well, this young sister, I guess she's about 25 or so. I'm 62 now. So anybody younger than 30 to me is almost like a kid, young enough to be my child. So she attempted to paraphrase that, and she came up with something altogether different, but that I really like, and that is, the more you love your history, the more you love yourself. And this is so important in our community. I so wish, with all due respect, that we had a crowd of young people here, the ones who need the information the most, the ones whose lives can still be molded, the ones who are doing, in most cases, the most destructive damage in many ways in our community. And somehow we have to be able to reach them. So she said, the more you love yourself, the more you love your history, the more you love yourself. And I think that perhaps what we really need more than anything is a serious dose of self-love. Almost like we have to start all over again, to believe in each other again, and to trust each other again, and have confidence in each other again, and to support each other again, not to give up. I think it's very easy as you get older to get jaded, to get cynical, to think of us in many ways as a broken people who will never recover again. And sometimes I confess I do have my doubts. I think that for most of us, empowerment in our community is not a priority, it's a desire. It's something we do if it doesn't cost any money. It's something we do if it doesn't take too much time. It's something we do if the game isn't on. It's something to do if we don't have to stay up too late, or join an organization, or sit on the other side of the room. Some of the things we're talking about are so simple, and yet they're the most difficult. So anyway, let me just go through some of these pictures and then show you the new ones. I always have to acknowledge the scholars who molded me. Here I am with the great Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, a leading authority on the African presence in ancient America, and with a great Egyptologist named Joseph Ben Yakinen, and another great African scholar who lived in Chicago named John G. Jackson, and the whole crew. And the great Dr. John Henry Clark. I don't know if you know their names, but these people were very, very important in my development. And Mother Tanetta Muhammad, a Muslim sister. She was the wife of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And here I am, looking really serious. I don't understand why, because I'm at a wedding. You would think I would have with a good friend of mine. You would think I'd have a joyous look on my face. And sitting next to me, we're in Cape Coast in West Africa. Sometimes it's kind of hard to smile when you're in that area. I don't know if you know Cape Coast. Cape Coast is where two of the biggest dungeons are in all of Africa. This is where our ancestors were kept before they were put on those floating coffins that we call slave ships. And they're literally in walking distance. If I were to go outside this building, I could probably see it. How many of you have been to West Africa? How many of you have been to Africa, period? How many of you have been to Ghana or Senegal, somewhere in West Africa? It's a very powerful experience, isn't it? Especially when you go to these places, because when we were taken out of these places called the door of no return, the plan wasn't for you to return. Maybe it was a divine plan.
The car.
But physically, the plan wasn't for you to come back. You were supposed to be finished. You were done with Africa. And so for the descendants of those enslaved Africans to come back home and stand in those very places, it's an incredible experience.
Spiritual.
Yes, it is, that I wish we could all have. I think we don't realize, at least for me, how many demons we have inside of us as a result of enslavement, how much we've been warped and brutalized until you are forced to confront that very reality. And I'm speaking from experience. I think I may have mentioned this before, I'll tell it again right quick. I've been to Africa so many times I've forgotten how many times I've been there. I've been to 33 of the 54 so-called sovereign African countries. And I don't know if there's really a sovereign African country in reality, because the economy, the educational system, the judicial system in these countries are still very much controlled by Europeans, or the Eurocentric. You can imagine being in some of these places, like, for example, in a courtroom in countries that have been independent for 50 years, and a black judge will come out with one of those white wigs that you see in an English movie. So it's still very, very Eurocentric. So anyway, I started traveling to Africa in the early 1990s. I specifically went to Egypt. And then in the year 2000, after several trips to Egypt, which is in Africa, by the way, I got invited, because everybody don't know Egypt is in Africa. I got invited to Southern Africa, and I did a whole series of presentations. And every time I would do a presentation in front of a huge audience, I would get really emotional, almost start to cry at the podium. And I start telling the audience about these dreams I've been having right in the middle of the presentation. And the dreams were, and forgive me if I've told you this before, that it was really nightmares. That I know I live around in this area somewhere, and I'm driving all around, I can never find my home. Very unsettling. You drive down this street, go around the corner, down the boulevard, the alley, etc., knowing I live in this area somewhere, but could never quite find where I live. And the other dream would be I would go visit my family in Los Angeles, and they wouldn't want me to be there. They'd laugh at me, wouldn't eat with me, had these nice soft beds, but I had to sleep on the floor. And I'd sometimes call my family in the middle of the night after having one of these dreams and raise holy Cain with them. And they said, boy, you must be crazy, because we love each other very much. And I realized those dreams had a much greater significance, and that because we were taken from our homes, we don't really know where we come from. Most of us don't. And because we were separated from our families, I think that perhaps there's a fear of separation, a kind of a sense of rejection and alienation. At least that's what I had. And the audience would always say, but Runoko, this is your home. And we are your family. I never had those dreams anymore after that. See, it's like those demons were exorcised from me, but I had to confront them in order to have that cleansing experience. I think those demons are in all of us. They're in our minds, the pain and the suffering and the humiliation that came from enslavement are still, because we never really talked about it. When you have a tragedy at a workplace or at a school, somebody is going to come and walk those people through that. You're going to have some help. We didn't have that from enslavement. And I think those demons are still right there. Perhaps that's what's going on in my mind right now. In the middle is a brother, Dr. Asa Hilliard, and then on the far end in the green is a great scholar named Dr. Leonard Jeffries. And here I am in Washington, D.C., next to a statue of the great Carter G. Woodson, one of our greatest scholars, went to Harvard, as if that means a lot. And because I say that because Henry Louis Gates is at Harvard now. You got to watch everything he says. He still doesn't believe the ancient Egyptians were black people in 2017. And this is the guy on TV. Why do you think he's on TV? So Carter G. Woodson is one of our greatest scholars, and he almost single-handedly began what's called Negro History Week, that later began Black History Month. And then these are my two new books. Literally, this came out a month and 2 days ago. It's called My Global Journeys in Search of the African Presence, 368 pages. Maybe my best book ever, that's a plug. And my first book for children. That's my daughter on the cover. I took her and her mom to Egypt with me over the summer. And if you've been to West Africa, I encourage you to go to North Africa, to go to Egypt if you can. Anybody been to Egypt? It's remarkable, isn't it? And this is my first book for children, and it's a global African journey. Now, let me show you some pictures now, and I'll try not to be too long-winded, which is kind of difficult for me. This is an ancient African counting stick. It's called the Ishango bone. It's about 25,000 years old, and it's from Central Africa. And you can see notches carved on the surface of the bone in sequential order, 25,000 years old. And these are ancient African fishing harpoons, 50 to 75,000 years old. Wasn't even a European in existence at that time. So African history is very old. It's just that we've been taught that Africa is the worst place it ever was. So a lot of us, black as night, will say, I ain't no African. Just because you've been taught to be ashamed of Africa. Let's face it, you African booty scratcher. How many times have we heard these demeaning terms about Africa growing up? Thank God for slavery, because at least it got us out of Africa. We could be like those Africans. You remember a couple years ago, we were all going to die from the Ebola virus. Now you don't hear people talking about that anymore. So we are programmed 24/7 to be anti-African, to want to be anything other than an African. So part of my job is to help you get comfortable with your African self. Sister, I see you looking at those chairs. No. Over there, please. You can sit in the front if you want. As beautiful as you are, you should want everybody to see you. I've embarrassed her and put her on the spot. Everybody looking now. Let's go to Egypt. And then I want to kind of talk about the theme that Pastor was referencing earlier. Now, this is the first pharaoh that we know, the first man whose name we know in history. His name is Narmer. I want you to let that sink in for a minute. This is the first person whose name we actually know in history. And he married a woman, a black woman, I'm happy to say, named Night Hotep. This is 5,000 years ago. First time we hear of a man and a woman in history, and it's in Africa. And then you have this brother right here named Imhotep, who designed the world's first large stone building. I took this photograph at a museum that I'd never heard of in Barcelona in August. Look at those big Barack Obama ears. And I miss our brother, for sure. I miss Michelle too. Because this idiot that we got in the White House now, who knows what's gonna happen? Yeah, pray for him. I would say pray for something to happen to him, but that wouldn't be right, would it? Now, this is the first man of science, and he designed this building. But here's something I just found out about him, and I don't know how you're going to take this, but it's historically accurate. He lived nearly 5,000 years ago, and he is the first person to be called the Son of God. Now, I don't know how you feel about that, being in a church, and I'm not trying to attack anybody's faith. He's the first person, a black man, to be called the Son of God that we know of. 3,000 years before the beginning of the Christian era. That's very profound. And this is his mother. Now, you're not going to see this on TV, I assure you. Henry Louis Gates is not going to talk about it. It's not going to be on BT for sure. It's not going to be in any of the reality TV shows. We have our priorities mixed up. A lot of us can tell you who won the Grammys, who won the Oscar, who won the Super Bowl, how many points LeBron scored. But if you were to ask the average black person on the street, name me one black person who lived before slavery, you draw a blank. Because that's not our priority. These are just some of the great kings from the pyramid age. And I love to see that. Not behind him, next to him, beside him. And he doesn't look stressed out. He doesn't look like his masculinity, his manhood is being challenged. He's very comfortable with it. I love that. Because if we can't do anything else, black men and black women need to come together. If we can't do that, then I mean, what hope is there for us if we can't do these very, very basic things? African empowerment is not rocket science. It's the application that's hard. Because we've been programmed to feed into white supremacy. When I see a brother with his pants hanging down, I wanted to say, brother, pull your pants up. Spend your money with other black people. Join an organization. Be a better father. I'm talking about basic things. All right. Look at the hair here. Just go through these dynasties quick. This is the same king portrayed as an older man and a young man. This brother here is named Sahura. he sent an expedition to the Horn of Africa, a place that the Africans considered God's land. Look at that nice afro. I flew all the way to Lisbon, Portugal to photograph this. See how the noses have been gouged out in many cases. One of my favorite kings, and this is my favorite king. His name is Nama Amenhotep III. Look at those huge ears. Now, I don't know if that's a family characteristic or it's symbolic. They used to say ignorance is evil. And the idea was the bigger the ear, the more you could hear, and the more you heard, the more you would know, and the more you knew, the more power you would possess. I like that. Don't run from knowledge, run to it. Embrace it. The problem is, with knowledge comes responsibility. And many people would prefer to not know. Now, what I'm doing right now, a king and a queen, because what good is a king without a queen? What I'm doing right now, I've set myself a task, and God willing, I'm going to finish it over the next year or two. And that is to visit, this may sound really ambitious, but why not? To visit every museum in the world with an African collection and to photograph it. It's never been done before. And I'm about 85% finished already. It's a remarkable achievement. Now here's a picture, thank you. Here's an image of a woman who was very powerful. Her name is Amos Nefertari. How do we know she was powerful? Well, we just look at her. Now the Egyptians themselves were black people, but when you see a person painted black, you know that's very, very symbolic, because in this day and age, black was considered the color of the divine. For some of us, it still is. But not for everybody. I spent 12 years in San Antonio, Texas, and there was a Negro minister, and I'm using the word Negro minister quite deliberately here, who was famous for saying he'd be dead before he allowed an image of a black Christ in his church. He said, I'd lose all my congregation. I would like to think he was wrong. So these images also show the power and majesty of black women. No B words back then. No N words either. Shouldn't be any today. And the worst thing you could do is disrespect your mother. That was considered unthinkable. Just look at the hair. This should tell us alone who they were. But hair is a touchy subject in our community, and I'm going to leave that one alone. Now, this is the most often portrayed woman in ancient Egyptian history. Her name is Queen Tai. She was not of royal birth. She married a king, a man who became king. She was the mother of a king. In fact, she's the mother of a man credited with being the first person to say that there's only one God, a man named Akhenaten. I think that Africans always understood that God was one, but there were different aspects or manifestations of God. And she's the mother-in-law of Nefertiti. Everybody's heard of her. And she's the mother or grandmother of King Tut. So let me show you some images of her. This is perhaps my favorite. This is in Brussels, Belgium. And most of these pictures I've taken within the last year or so. Most of them since I was here last. This is in Florence, Italy, in Paris, in London, in Boston. And this is the most famous one. This is in Berlin. And that's really one of the best pictures I've ever taken. The lighting, everything was just right. And this is what she looked like. She just like y'all. She could be a member of this church. She could be sitting here today. I don't like to think that she's looking over us and saying, it's about time. Look at those big, beautiful lips. Don't be ashamed of who you are. There she looks serious. And here she is again as a young woman. Look at the hair. There's her significant other. His name is Amenhotep III. The name Amenhotep means Amen is foremost, or Amen is up front. Amen. Did you know that the term amen even comes out of Africa? And these are all her husband. They were very much in love, and you can see them portrayed here. That's what I call eternal love. How I would love to find that in my life. I'm working on it. But I've been working on it for a long time, okay? These are their daughters. And this is Akhenaten himself. You see the art during this period of time is very distinct. We call this the Amarna period. It's a phase in Egyptian history. Even the fragments of the face tell you who he was. So there should be no doubt about who we're talking about. Look at how they molded their head. You can still find this in Central Africa today. This is Nefertiti. And again, and the royal couple together with their children. This one is simply called A Stroll in the Garden. This is in a museum in Berlin. I don't know, I could be wrong. This is King Tut. This is the youngster who didn't really do anything. His only significance really was that his tomb wasn't broken into in ancient times. I would just like to think that if our young people could see this, everything would be different in our community. You wouldn't be hurling the B word around. You wouldn't be talking about the N word like it's a term of endearment. Surely you wouldn't be shooting each other down in the street. You would see more value attached to Black life. You wouldn't take it so randomly, without a thought. It's like we don't see the humanity in ourselves anymore. And in many ways, we're not going in a good direction. We need to get a grip. These are Cushites. Again, I just like to see us together. When I see a Black man and a Black woman together, I mean, I just get a thrill. Because it's not as common as it once was. People be talking about, I don't see color. I don't see race. And yet you're the first one to get fired. Right. Last one to get hired. As soon as you walk in the store, somebody's following you around. You're subject to get shot in the street with your hands up in the air in broad daylight, pleading, don't shoot. You're the first one to get killed in the movie. And then you tell me you don't see color. How can you not see it? Now you are in denial is what it is. Now you can say, I'm able to transcend race. I'm able to see beyond that. But please don't tell me you don't see color. Either you're Mr. Magoo, or you're a fool, or you're in denial. You pick them. You have multiple choice. And you know what? They look happy. Now this is Ramses the Great in the light colored stone and his eternal love, Nefertari. These are all Ramses the Great. People who talk about the Exodus would say it happened either in the reign of this man or his son. And this, I don't know if I better spend much time with this one, but this is an example, an early example of what we would call the Immaculate Conception. If you like, we can come back to that in the question and answer period. I don't want to step on any toes here. And this is Asar, also known as Osiris. He is the first resurrected Savior. And look at what color he is. He's called the Lord of the Perfect Black. See, this comes from Africa. This is not in Rome. This is not in Greece, even though it influenced the Romans and the Greeks. These just beautiful people. Just look at the hairstyle. I don't know if she's an acrobat or a dancer or that's yoga or what. But whatever it is, she's limber. Now, I could do that, but I don't want to embarrass anybody. I could easily get on this table and do that, but I don't want to show up. See how well preserved many of these pieces are? This is a king, and this, I tell you, looks just like the Cowardly Lion in the Wizard of Oz, this piece right here. This is a king named Taharka. It's mentioned in the Old Testament, I think, 3 times. And all these images I photographed, or at least a lot of them, in Sudan. This is Cleopatra right here. And that's her son in the background. This is from the Roman period. And of course, here's the period I got a better photograph of this since the last time I saw you. I've shown this many times. But I went back to Egypt over the summer in July, and I got a much better picture of what is called the Coptic Christ. Jesus emerging from his tomb after the crucifixion. You can see it for yourself. I didn't invent this. It's not a drawing, it's a historical document. And you can make of it what you want. But it certainly doesn't look like most of the images of Jesus that we see. And it's important. Didn't you hear somewhere that God created you in his own image? Now look at me. My eyes are not blue, and my hair is not blonde, and my skin is not pale. Now, if God created me in his own image, what does that say about God? At least be prepared to entertain the idea that God looks like you. Somebody said, I mentioned him earlier, Dr. John Henry Clark, perhaps the worst thing about enslavement is that what came with it is the colonization of our image of God.
Yep.
My daughter in Egypt with me over the summer, a shining moment. I had, for a long time, said to myself, I want my daughter to see the pyramids with me when she sees them for the first time. She's 11 now. Unfortunately, she doesn't seem to want to follow my footsteps at all. I said, you want to be a historian like your daddy? No. Last year, I brought her over to the United States for the first time. She lives right outside of Paris. I'm going to bring her back in about 2 weeks. And I took her into my studio in Los Angeles. I have a huge library, as you can imagine. She said, Daddy, you have so many books. I said, you like it? She says, yes, Daddy, I love them. She says, when you die, I'm going to sell every one and get the money. And she's just as serious as she could be. You know, I mean, she didn't mean any harm. She has a mercenary streak. At least I know my books won't go to waste. And then here's another scholar. We're on a cruise ship on the Nile, and I'm with a brother named Ashra Kwesi, who loves to talk about religion. Okay? For me, it's not so important because, in my opinion, it's not who you worship or who you say you worship, it's what you do. That's what's most important to me. I judge a person by their deeds, not by their words. So Kwesi and I have had our differences over the years, but we really got along on this trip. At least we acted like it. It's very important that the community sees the scholars working together. Because otherwise they think there's a kind of sibling rivalry. Our egos are so big, we're unable to work together. We need to sometimes just bury the hatchet. You're still mad at me because I stole your girlfriend in high school 50 years ago. She went to the prom with me and not you. We are quick to hold a grudge with each other and yet forgive other people who don't even ask for forgiveness. Now, I don't want to step on anybody's toes. I've said that about 3 times now. But I'm struck by the example of this guy, Dylan Roof, I guess his name is, in South Carolina, who shot those 9 people to death on their knees in a church praying. Some of those sisters and brothers forgave him before their relatives were buried. He didn't even ask for forgiveness. But we'll hold a grudge against each other for 1,000 years. We have to get beyond that and see the bigger picture. And this is another colleague of mine in Sudan. I took a group to Sudan over the summer. Again, it's just important that we see that people see us working together. Now, I've talked about Egypt a lot. These images are from Sudan, south of Egypt. This was a serious trip. Now, I took 20 people there, and we were there for like about 8 days. It's average probably 108 degrees. And there was no air conditioning. And we stayed in places where there was no running water and no flushing toilets. We had to carry our own food. Most of us didn't take a serious shower for like 4 or 5 days at a time. This was a trip that you really had to want. You had to really want to be a part of this experience, and yet nobody complained. It was a trip of a lifetime because we had it all to ourselves. These are just some of the temples that we saw. I didn't take a lot of pictures of people on this trip, mostly temples, but this one is pretty good. These are young Sudanese brothers north of Khartoum, and I did manage to get a smile out of them. You can see the difference here. They look so serious. And a moment later, I got a smile out of them. And you know, another thing interesting about it, none of these people would take any money. Like a lot of times you feel like these people are much more poor than I am, so you want to offer them something. No, they saw us as family, and they had such pride. Okay, let me get through this and I'll finish up. This is an interesting one. This is where the Blue Nile River and the White Nile River come together and flow as one. And I use this as kind of symbolism as to what we must do. The Nile River is the longest, mightiest river in the world. It's 4,200 miles long. It flows from south to north. It starts in Central Africa and empties into the Mediterranean Sea. And along the Nile, great cities grew up in ancient times. But the Nile is composed of several tributaries. You have the Blue Nile, you have the White Nile, you have the Victoria Nile, you have a river called the Atbar River, and at some point they flow together. And I'd like to think that that's what we are in the process of doing, coming together, flowing together, and becoming one mighty stream. This is a tomb. It's at a place called Old Dongala. And in this mountain, the local people believe this is where the spirit of Amen dwells. This mountain is called Gebel Barkal. And I never thought I would see it. Just look, we had it all to ourselves. One night we actually pitched tents and slept out there. Yeah, this is an evening you never forget. And I'm telling you, the stars are so bright when you're in the desert like that, like you could just pluck them out of the sky. No, these are from Sudan. I hope to take a group back there next year. Okay. All right, Runoko. These are from Nigeria, from West Africa. Nigerians a lot of times think we talk about Egypt too much. And you should talk about Nigeria. You should talk about West Africa. And indeed, these artifacts are very beautiful. Africa is a big place. Africa is nearly 12 million square miles. And these are from Mali. Look at these big earrings. Gold. Africa's not poor. Africans are poor. Because Africa is being raped and robbed and pillaged and plundered. So Africa is not poor. Africans are poor because they're not able to access those vast mineral resources. Look at the gold earrings there. Again, from West Africa, from China, from Japan, and Vietnam. All these are from Southeast Asia. This is a trip I took in January. Look at the architecture here. Brother Kwabi Na Hotel from ancient Vietnam. So the African diaspora didn't start with slavery, and it's not just in the Americas, it's all over the world. Now these are from Vietnam, Vietnam, Thailand again. Look at those lips. The lips don't lie. Neither does the hair. Look at those knots. This is the Buddha. Cambodia and Thailand again and Vietnam, and look, 1,000 years old. Cambodia. I have more of these from Southeast Asia than I thought. This is a black nomad from Central Asia. And of course, these images represent the African presence in early Europe. This is from Greece. This is from Athens. But Athens isn't far from Corinth. Corinth is where Paul preached. There was a black community there. I believe that's where he wrote Corinthians. Pastor would know more about that than me. This is in Greece. A black jockey. You know, even in the United States, the earliest jockeys, the most successful ones, were enslaved Africans and sometimes freed black people in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. So a lot of us don't even know recent history. I've had people say, is Michael Jackson Jesse Jackson's younger brother? Is Martin Luther King the one who freed slaves? So we have an abysmal lack of knowledge of self, even recent stuff. All from ancient Greece and Rome, from Persia. This is from ancient Iran. This is from Jordan, the head of a black man. This is in the Seattle Museum of Art. It's 2,000 years old in Jordan. This is from early Italy before the Romans. And so is this one. I just took this picture of these last two in Munich, Germany in January. This is 2,500 years old. And this one looks so familiar. This is from the Roman world. Isn't there an image of Christ like that? Carrying a ram or a sheep or something over his shoulders like that? Oh, these are from early Italy. That's Hercules on the other side. You have the brother on one side and Hercules on the other. Here's a black man in Rome balancing himself on the back of a crocodile. That must take some skill. The son of the African-born emperor of Rome. A little white pyramid in Rome. Now, our scholar, she's an ancestor now, Dr. Frances Welsing, would run with this one because you have the big brown pyramids in Africa and the little white pyramid in Rome. You see the psychological implications of that. I'm in church. Okay. This is the coat of arms of the Pucci family, an aristocratic family in the Italian Renaissance in Florence. That one's out of sequence. A black man in Spain 700 years before the people called the Moors. In the European Renaissance, you see the black king who came to pay homage to the Christ child in the manger in Bethlehem. The story is there were three kings, one from Asia, one from Africa, one from Europe, drawn and guided by the star in the heavens, who went to the manger in Bethlehem to pay homage to the Christ child. One brought frankincense, one brought gold, one brought myrrh. When in the European Renaissance, it was the African, specifically the Ethiopian, who brought the gift of myrrh. And this is what this painting is 500 years ago. In Denmark, another one of the three wise kings who looked just like Bernie Mac. This is in Germany. These are 500 years old. And you can see the brother with the swagger there. Look, it's kind of leaning toward the side. He got the red hat kind of tilted to the side. And even here, you can see who's the dominant figure in there. Now, it was the Ethiopian who was the youngest and the one who stands farthest away from the Christ child. And I have a lot of these. Here is Simon of Cyrene carrying Christ's cross up the hill in Calvary. This is in a museum in Paris. It's so lifelike. Look at this brother right here. Sharp, sharp, sharp. Some of our black folk. Just like you all. I bet if we had a comparison between white churches, if there are any white churches in Gary, and black churches, y'all would be by far the best dressed, okay? Maybe we take more pride in our appearance. And this is one of the nicest ones. You see the Ethiopian king there and the attendants on the top. Black kings. The head of a Moor, golden head of a Moor, one more. And I could just show you these all day long. Now you see the black saint and the white saint. They're in positions of perfect equality. This is before the slave trade, which changed everything. That's why I implore you, don't start with slavery. Don't ignore it, but don't begin there. Okay, I think you get my picture. There's a knight in shining armor. This is a painting by the famous painter Peter Paul Rubens. This is in Brussels. Another black saint in Tallinn. Riga in Latvia. No, it is Tallinn. In Estonia, I took this picture in January. And this one I took last year. This is in Northern Europe. His name is Saint Maurice. Unmistakably black. You may have seen this painting, Juan Perea, a painting by a man named Velázquez, a Spanish painter. This sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars at an auction. Another knight in shining armor, Saint Maurice. This is a manhole cover. I spent a lot of time in January, just a couple months ago, in Germany. A lonely trip, believe me. Some cases I didn't see any black people for days at a time. But I kept going. And in this city, a town called Coburg, you have the patron saint is a Moor, a black man. And even the manhole covers in the center of the city have his face adorned there. Oh, this is in front of City Hall. A bejeweled Moor in Dresden, Germany, in a place called Freising, Germany, in Brussels, Belgium, in a close-up, and a Moor with an astrolabe or a clock. This is in Nuremberg, Germany. Looks a lot like Laurel Hill. This is a very famous sculptor or piece of art. And then the slave trade. So you move from black men being portrayed as kings to black men being emasculated, more or less being portrayed as boys, mascots, very non-threatening figure. The slave trade did that. Right. It changed the way the world saw us, it changed the way we saw ourselves. And we're still suffering from that today. Many of us, young brothers, I think even wonder, what does it mean to be a man? What is a man supposed to do? What are the responsibilities of manhood? I mean, basic, fundamental things. And that's an even better example right there. Now look at the little black figure. Everybody else is large size, but the black man has been reduced in status. The slave trade did that. But you see, if you start with slavery, you won't realize that before slavery we were something else. And slaves, by the way, didn't come from Africa. Africans were captured. They weren't slaves, they were people. Mothers and fathers and husbands and wives and sons and daughters, and they were captured and they were dehumanized. And yet they survived all that. Now we may be crazy, but we survived. Now we have to go beyond survival and heal again. Not an easy process. All right. A black Madonna child. These are considered superstars of the cult of Mary. And because they are black, it is thought they're able to perform miracles. This is the most recent one I photographed. This is in Toulouse in southern France. All right, let me finish with these images from the Americas, back in the day, or black in the day, you might say. These are the Olmec heads that represent the first civilization of the Americas thousands of years ago. And there are 20 of these heads, and to my knowledge, I'm the only person that I personally know that's seen and photographed all of them. So I'm going to show you those now, and that'll be how I end the presentation. Again, by looking at Africans before enslavement. I cannot emphasize that theme enough. And I'm taking a group to Mexico this summer. I take another group to Cuba this summer, another group to Southern Africa this summer, and then to Morocco in September. These trips are open to the public, and I encourage you to go to my website and perhaps travel with me, because it's nothing like seeing it for yourself. Okay. No two of these heads are the same. This one is called El Rey, the king, thousands of years ago. And I even photographed them from all sides. I didn't want to miss anything. This one, you can see it has brown paint on it, because they were originally painted a rich brown color, apparently. Look at this one. This is a group I took there, I think, 3 years ago. And this is one of the biggest ones. We don't know who they are. I suspect they were black kings who ruled over what is now Mexico. You can see the comparison, I think. So Mexican scholars tell us we're stealing their history by claiming that Africans went to ancient Mexico. Tell it to this brother. Okay. And these are the beat up heads. This one is an astronomer. It's a black man watching the sky. This one appears to be sleeping, like what I know some of you all are dying to do right now because I can see your body language. So I'll finish. This is the biggest one. It's 80,000 pounds. That's okay. You almost got through it. I see you struggling over there. This is the first one of the heads that was excavated, I think in 1868. And look how serious this is. Fierce. This is one of the smaller heads, but one of the most important ones because this one is the one with the braids in the back. Yeah, they were Africans who sailed across the Atlantic thousands of years ago. And finally, you have this one called El Negro. These are all from ancient Mexico. These things are not taught in the Mexican schools any more than they're taught in the schools in Gary. I don't suppose they're taught here. If it was taught in the schools, we wouldn't probably be as crazy as we are. But after all, whose responsibility is it for us to know our history? It's our responsibility. And if we don't, I mean, whose fault is that? Look, close up. El Negro. This is about 3,500 years old. And this one. Now, I only have about 150,000 photographs now. Don't worry. I think I showed you today about 250. But I have a fantasy, and that is to get people in a room and lock the door. Maybe put a Rottweiler outside or something like that. And then just have food and water brought in and force you. And then the only way you can get out is go to the bathroom. Force you to see all 150,000 photographs from ancient Mexico. Now this is Mayan, and what it appears to have is an Olmec head on top, as if the Mayan were saying, we acknowledge those who came before us. It's important to acknowledge those who came before us. From Cuba, I took a group of 55 people to Cuba in December, biggest trip I've ever had. These are murals from Cuba, and this is where we began. Our history did not begin in chains, we're not end in chains. So I want to thank you all for coming out. I want to thank Pastor for inviting me again. We had a good crowd today. And more, the people who come to my presentations here are actually members of the church, not just members from the community. And that means a lot. That means you have support of this man has your support. This great man shows a hunger and thirst for knowledge of self. It's very, very important. How do you prepare for today and tomorrow if you don't know what happened yesterday? And it's not just lack of knowledge, it's lack of interest. So your presence today indicates that you are interested in who we are and what we've done and what we have the capacity to do. And I think that's very special. So thank you all, and God bless you. Who asks questions, and that'll determine how much time I'm going to spend. And we have Dr. Hicks here. I was at the university not long ago. Yeah, I'm talking about you, sis. At the university not long ago, and they had me do a short presentation because they wanted me to have interaction with the audience, which turned out to be a good thing. So here we seem to have the best of both worlds. Let me see your hands, and I'll tell you how much time I'm gonna run my mouth. Okay, wow, lots of hands. Yes, sister.
You said you're doing a trip to Mexico?
Yeah.
Now, are you gonna do the trip where, you're gonna go to the black town where there was, black slaves? And they don't wanna talk about it, cause I have a friend that's Mexican, and he said there is a black town that you should visit in Mexico. And they have, one of the, he was a conqueror, slave.
Well, you know, I did that. I've been doing tours to Mexico the last 4 years. And last year we did that, but it's hard to do the towns and the heads at the same time. And a lot of the places where the heads are, I mean, the towns are, they're kind of rough areas to get in and out of. So this year we're gonna just do the heads, but we have an extension for those who wanna stay longer and see those communities. Now there's about, I don't know, I would say at least 2 to 3 million black people in Mexico today. So you have a long history. So you have the Olmec phase, and probably black people there even before the Olmec, before heads. And then you have Africans who are captured and brought there. And those sisters and brothers have really, really low self-esteem. A lot of the black people in the Hispanic countries, all they basically know is that they were slaves. So we have a lot of work to do. Next question. Yes.
Those two heads that you showed in Mexico, I saw one in there that looked like one of my neighbors. Was that a mistake? No. Could you elaborate on it? It was not. No, it was dark. Yeah.
Tell me when I get there. I don't know your name.
Right there, yeah.
Well, that's not a head. Well, it is a head, but it's not an Olmec head. This is somebody from Sudan.
Oh.
Or maybe that's your neighbor. Maybe I got that
No,
wrong.
I just said he could be my neighbor.
But you know, a lot of the pictures that I showed could be our neighbors. Because we're family.
This is a recent picture that you took.
This is the only picture in here, I think,
Oh, yeah, that's.
that I didn't take. This is from a book, and this is a man from the country called Sudan today. He's from a community called Nuba.
Do you have information about
I'm gonna get the microphone. We'll bring it around. I'm not gonna forget you. Yes.
Question, just a couple of questions. What would be, because you're on YouTube also, so what would be the best YouTube that kind of allows you to tell the story? And then what would be the best book besides your new book that really gives us an encapsulation of our history?
Well, in terms of YouTube, yeah, I'm on YouTube a lot. A lot of times people film me and I don't know, or they just, in fact, I should have said that today. Turn your cell phones off, but it's too late now. And next thing you know, it's on YouTube. But there's of all the things that are of me are on YouTube, the one that I think is the best is called the Melanin Movement. And it's me talking about the migrations of African people in ancient and modern times, a brief soundbite, and then pictures for about 3 or 4 minutes, and it's set to some music by Quincy Jones. And it's very, very, very good. I use it sometimes for promotional purposes. I also have another excellent YouTube video that's me showing these heads, as a matter of fact, in a museum in Jalapa, Mexico. Books that are not my own, there's one book that changed my life dramatically, and I still recommend it. It's called The Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams. Because that book addressed several basic questions. One is, what happened to us? How do we lose it? And then how we can get it back. And he talked about Africans who had great civilization back in the day and African migrations out of Africa before enslavement. So if there was one book, Destruction of Black Civilization would probably be the one. The author is Chancellor Williams. Anybody can reach me, by the way. I've run out of business cards. I'm having some new ones printed. But anybody can reach me at runoko@hotmail.com. RUNOKO@hotmail.com. I'll repeat it. You can go to my website for information about the tours, which is drrunoko.com, drrunoko.com. And you can even call me at area code 323-803-8663. Text me or something.
I know you probably addressed this in previous presentations, but I'd like to know, why is the nose lopped off so much?
Yeah, I get that all the time. And that's controversial because we don't really absolutely know for certain. But I think that that was a result of a kind of a religious ritual associated with death. For a long time, I would say that these mean, nasty white folks came and knocked those noses off because they looked so black. And that's what a lot of people think. But I've never seen any evidence for that. And you also see a lot of that in purely European statues from Rome. So you can, on the one hand, say white invaders knocked them off out of racial animus in Africa, and then find the same phenomenon among Europeans themselves. So I think it means that we need to dig a little deeper and be prepared to be a little more analytical and dig beneath the surface. Now, I just mentioned this book, which I still think is great, Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams. But I think maybe the cardinal error in that book is that, and maybe this is why it resonated with me and other people because he wrote it as if it was from the perspective of right now, which is a mistake. I think the worst thing that a historian can do is to look back at the past in another culture with the same vision that we have right now and assume that the ancient world thought like we do in terms of race and class and gender. If you're a serious historian, and I try to be one, I think it's very important to try to study things from the mindset of the people that you're looking at and not project your own mindset. And so based on our experience today, it's almost natural, since we have been so abused, to assume that Europeans knocked those noses off, but there's no evidence for it. Doctor, how are you?
How are you?
I'm good.
I want to thank with that pastor for bringing me here, because I was a
Pastor
host.
Jackson.
Yes, Pastor Jackson. Let's just give him a round of applause. Experience. I didn't get to ask any questions when I was the host, and now I have a chance to ask at the university.
And this beautiful young lady was also at the program, dressed in the pink back there. She's
That's
very
right.
quiet today.
Cheers. All right. Okay. The question that I had, because anthropology and history is so much more exciting now that the trip is coming out. It's all that fancy that existed before. And one of the questions, I teach one of my courses, the way the university has it set up is titled The Black Female Experience from Slavery to the Present. However, I don't start with slavery. We start with the African heritage. And my students learn so much from you, from the presentation that you did, because you can't spend as much time as you would like on the African past. But the question that I have deals with race, and it deals with the concept of whiteness that emerged, following the transatlantic slave trade period. And the anthropologists are now talking about mitochondrial Eve, and how all of the human beings on the planet have African genes, okay? And we know that from some of these findings that the only differences are based on those environmental differences that have you develop certain physical, like plants grow differently and look differently based on what type of environment they're in. However, when we look at the psychology of people, we find that there are some differences between those who are more recent, because Africans were here thousands of years before the Europeans. And there's some research now, and I want to know if you know anything about that research that says that some of those groups that walked out of Africa, even though they do have African heritage, they mixed with some of the other types of hominids. And might that be a contributor to some of that mindset that exists? Because we talk about Ice Age and all of that, but there's got to be something else. So I want to know what you found about that.
All right. Well, your mic started working. I thought mine might start again, but I guess everybody can hear me pretty well. About in the 1930s, not 1930s, 1980s, the 1980s, there it is, there began to be studies of what is called nuclear DNA polymorphisms, genetic studies, and then it evolved by the early 1990s into studies of mitochondrial DNA, which can only, as I understand it, can only be traced to the genes of women. And these studies, as Doc indicated, show that there's really only one race, and that's the human race, which began in Africa. So thus we call her the mitochondrial Eve, and we come up with what is called the out of Africa hypothesis, that humanity began in Africa and spread all over the world. Now there's discussions saying that the Africans, black people, are the only true human beings in the world, because we're the only ones that didn't mix with the Neanderthals. Now I haven't studied that very carefully, you know. But I do know that those Africans who went into Europe, as a professor indicated, got caught up in those terrible Ice Age conditions, and not only changed phenotypically, physically, but also were affected by those harsh climates. It became a colder, harder, more competitive person, aggressive, believed that might makes right, and survival of the fittest, and a dog is a man's best friend. All of those concepts that we've heard so much about emerged out of the ice in Europe. And perhaps this is what produces the European mentality that we have today. You can see it, I suppose, the differences between President Obama and the current occupant of the White House. Here's a guy who seemed to say, let's love, not war. Let's put more emphasis on education than bombing other folk. But that didn't resonate with a large segment of the society that seemed to think that killing people was the simplest, easiest, and the most expedient way to deal with the problem. So I think that it's not so much the physical differences between ethnic groups that are important, but the psychological differences that a lot of us are not prepared to talk about. Who's next?
I had another question, but just to touch on a little bit of what she was talking about here, I've definitely done some reading on that. There's two books, one called Yuguru and another called The Iceman Inheritance.
Actually, it's Yorugu.
Thank you. I'm sorry. But those two books do a great assessment, whether you read it or not, on the psychology of European psychology and their evolution and to why they have so many different aspects of their culture that is different from ours. Now, it's also good to recognize, you brought up the whole Neanderthal DNA thing. Every other culture on the planet, besides Africans, they found Neanderthal DNA in. So pure Africans are the only ones who they did not find it in. So it's important to understand that part of it also. But my question.
Let me add two more books
Sure.
that you brought it up. Yorugu is a good one, Marimba Ani, and The Iceman Inheritance by Michael Bradley, but there are two others too. One is called The Cultural Unity of Black Africa by Sheikhan Tajuk,
Oh, okay.
GIOP. And then there's another one that's fairly new, and it's called Cold Wind from the North.
Oh, yeah.
By a brother named Ululela Wabogo, W-O-B-O-G-O. This just came out within the last 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
It's a big, thick book, so you might add those two. Your question?
In a lot of my talking with friends and family members when trying to get them to.
Were you also at that lecture at the university?
That's me.
I remember.
Thank
You said something that really disturbed me.
I did.
I'm going to repeat it for the audience. He mentioned, see, I love books. I'm a bookworm.
Yeah.
I'm a bookish. And he mentioned that he had tried to give, I'm paraphrasing now, books to young people, and they don't want books, they want videos.
Yeah.
It bothers me, but anyway.
Right, we had a little back and forth about that, how I felt we need to change our tactics to educate the young people to bring them to the book. We have
You
to change
changed.
this first. Yes, yeah.
I'm old. Yes, not your question.
But the common obstacle I come across is that a lot of American blacks, they don't really examine the cultural differences of Africans and other cultures and what that means for them as African Americans. But a lot of them, what they don't want to ask themselves and want to know the answer to is, why us? Why were we chosen? Because we always talk about the transition of how we were seen before
When
slavery.
you say us, who is us?
Africans. Why were Africans chosen by the Catholic Church to be chosen as slaves? Because it was what, you were at 14?
No, that's not that complicated.
Right, it's obviously a lot of different answers to why, but a lot of people don't understand that it was the Catholic Church who had a huge role in designating Africans as being legal to enslave them, and when they needed cheap labor and whatnot. Are there any materials or books that you would suggest that would answer those questions for them?
Yeah, there's a classic work. Thank you. For coming and raising those comments. There's a classic work published way back in 1945, I think Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams. Eric Williams was the prime minister, came to be the prime minister of Trinidad. Capitalism and Slavery is very, very good. You might also try the book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. And last but not least is a book by a Nigerian brother named Chin Wiser called The West and the Rest of Us. I think Capitalism and Slavery, and even some of the works by W.B. Du Bois probably deal with it. Africa is closer to the Americas than Europe. Okay. Africa had a large population, used to being engaged in agricultural labor. So when you put these factors together, it's not hard to see Africans came to be exploited and utilized as chattel labor. But you should start with Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams. Next question.
With African Americans being the original people, as I listened to both the doctors speak about it, you seem to justify Dr. Frances Cress Welsing's theory, her theory about melanin and the fact that Europeans don't produce that at all, and it has a lot to do with the ability to color the skin. But it also relates to the issue about the noses. It makes sense that even the European noses would be missing because the objective would be to convince others that, you know, we were really not the first people. And so if all the noses were gone, you'd have to get busy about, you know, proving the fact that, you know, the characteristics justify us being superior to you. So I just want you to speak a little bit about how what you both have just shared with us, how that links to Dr. Frances Cress Welsing's melanin theory.
I knew Frances, and she knew me. I met Frances Wilson for the first time, I think, in 1981, 82. I worked at Compton College at the time, and a colleague of mine invited her to speak. And after it was over, 3 or 4 of us had the good fortune of having dinner and drinks with Dr. Wilson. We argued all night long because I disagree with a lot of what Frances says. Frances is a psychiatrist. I'm a historian. So we have different disciplines, and I guess we see the world very differently. Now, I don't buy into the issue that the reason Europeans are crazier than even we are is because they have less melanin. Frances' position, as I understood it, and I don't mean any disrespect to the great Dr. Wilson, was that peoples of color, this is a term she frequently used, somehow are united on the basis of that. And I've never accepted that. The idea of the third world of people of color makes no sense to me. Because if it did make sense, we wouldn't be exploited by the Asians, the Arabs, the Pakistanis, the Indians, who seem to despise us even more than white people do. Now, and I don't know what that would have to do with the noses missing either. So, as for the noses, I have more questions than answers. One question. Where's the documentation for it? I mean, why can't we find that in the literature anywhere, whether it be in Roman literature or in Kemet? Why are some noses missing and others not? Are there more noses missing in some historical periods than others? So I have all of these questions. Why don't we find the noses missing from Ethiopia? Or West Africa? Why only the Mediterranean? So I'm real comfortable with that, not having the answers. That may sound contradictory and even foolish, but there's an African proverb that I repeat from time to time: only fools know everything. So at this stage in my life, it's not so important that I have all the answers, but I know the right questions to begin to ask so that we can get the answers. And we can disagree, what do they say? We can agree to disagree. But I think most important is that we should agree that the search has only just begun. That we live in an exciting period right now as we begin to try to reconstruct our history. Because I think that for the most part, African history, Black history, has barely been written. We have the greatest story that's barely been told. And I'm just hoping that we can continue to use forums like this to excite our imagination and perhaps excite and inspire some of these brilliant young people that have already spoken or haven't spoken to continue to do the research. It's very important to me.
as I get older, to find younger people to pass the baton to mentor and nurture so that they can take it beyond my wildest dreams. I think that the greatest attribute of a teacher is the students that they produce. And we should not hide knowledge and try to keep it all to ourselves. We should take pride in disseminating and sharing information so that it has the fullest impact. I think we may have time for one or two more.
I had one question. The lady with the mic first.
Oh, excuse me. That's okay. Okay. I had one question, but now I have two. So, the question I was going to ask originally was about the Immaculate Conception. You said you might want to go back to, if you can.
Well, I'm sensitive about talking about that in the church.
Talk about it.
Okay.
He said, talk about it. But just one quick question about, since mankind started in Africa then, where do they say the Neanderthals came from? Are they Africans also? And then why would not the original Africans have their DNA?
Well, that's an excellent question. Both of them. Neanderthal, now, you have this, everybody doesn't believe it, I do, that you have this evolutionary process which begins in Africa. So you have these early, even before hominids, what are called Australopithecines. And the earliest ones that I know of are called Australopithecus afarensis. And the most famous one is called Art Lucy. And there's another one I believe called Ardi, A-R-D-I. These are ancient skeletal fossils, more than 3 million years old. Now eventually, the Australopithecines seem to be followed by the hominids. And hominids are more on the direct line of modern humanity. First, you have what's called Homo habilis, which means, I think, handyman. And then you have Homo erectus, which means erect man. And then you have Homo sapiens. And Neanderthals are part of Homo sapiens. And apparently they migrated from Africa and found themselves isolated in various parts of Europe and Asia. Like the most famous ones are called Java man in Indonesia and Beijing or Peking man in China, even though those bones have been missing since World War II. And some of them went into Europe and I guess got isolated there. And then you have the latest phase of humanity, which is Homo sapiens sapiens, or wise man. And apparently they originated in Africa too, and went into Europe and I suppose Asia as well, and intermingled with some of those isolated Neanderthal populations. Now that's how I understand it. And so that the African would be the one with the purest lineage, okay? And also the most recent and most evolved form of humanity. Now let's look at this example of the Immaculate Conception. Now I'm sensitive about my host. I think it's very important that we be cognizant as to where we are. I don't want to step on anybody's faith or religious beliefs. I think this is very important. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think out of respect, that's important to me. But there is a story called the Osirian drama, and it goes something like this. One day, a loud voice called out unto the world that the King of all has come. I'm paraphrasing now, because they're versions of it. And the King of all was a man named Asar. The Greeks call him Osiris. Anytime you have a name like Ramesses, Osiris, Isis, Tutmosis, those are Greek names that have that IS sound. And he is the first savior. He's from a place called Ethiopia, which the Greeks called the land of the burnt-faced people, the black people. And he was brought forth to bring civilization to the world. And on the next day, his brother was born, a man named Set. I'll try to be brief. And Set and Asar were polar opposites. They're like the personification of good and bad, day and night, good and evil, and they fought for supremacy. Set is identified with the color red, Asar is identified with the color black. In fact, he's sometimes called the perfect black. And then, on the next day, a woman was born. Actually, there's another male figure, but he's not important in this equation right now, named Heru the Elder. And then you have a woman named Aset, who the the Greeks call Isis. The name Aset means the throne, and you see her in the form of an African woman with a little throne on top of her head. She was a magician also, and she could change forms and take the form of a bird. She's a very important woman. She introduced the concept of agriculture and domesticity, and she invented the wedding ring, according to these traditions, which are thousands of years old. And then you have, on the fifth day, a woman named Nephthys. She's born, and she married Set. Aset married Asar. Y'all follow me? Now, things were going pretty good, and Asar decided that his contribution towards civilization in Egypt was done, and that he would leave Egypt and go all over the world, beginning in Asia, and civilize the rest of the world. Now, the problem was he left his wife in charge, which enraged his brother Seth, who became very jealous and planned to murder Asar. And the way he had it designed was he would have an elaborate homecoming party when Asar came back, and he invited 72 conspirators. And he had, as a special feature of the party, a wooden chest made of ebony, studded with precious stones, and it was designed only to fit the body of Asar, nobody else. Asar is invited to the party. Aset decides not to go. She senses something is wrong, and she tries to tell the brother not to go, but you know how hard-headed we can be. A lot of times we don't like to listen, and we know everything. So he goes to the party, he drinks a little too much, and at the end of the party, says, okay, everybody, remember this, I'm paraphrasing. We have this magnificent chest, and whoever can fit in it can have it. But of course, it's been designed only to fit Asar's body. Everybody tries it, except Asar. He's the last one, and he gets in there. I can hear Aset saying, baby, don't get in that box. I ain't feeling good about this, but you know how we are. This is my brother. He jumps in the box, and sure enough, as soon as he gets in there, the lid is nailed shut, the lid, and Set throws his brother's body in the box in the Nile River where it floats away. Now, Aset, who had every reason to say, I told you so, told you not to get in there, doesn't do that. She doesn't give up. She tears her clothes, she rips out her hair, and she follows that box and finds it all the way in Lebanon and brings it back to Egypt and leaves it for some reason in a swamp. Now, Set is out hunting by the light of the full moon, finds the box, and realizes his brother is in there. He's astonished because he's supposed to be finished by now. So he takes a sharp knife, cuts the body up into 14 pieces, and scatters them all over Egypt. Now, the 14th piece is very significant. It's his phallus. It's thrown into the Nile River, where tradition says it was swallowed by a catfish. I'm unable to eat catfish as a result of this story. 13 other pieces, the sister, Aset, gathers up into the form of a mummy. You can see it here, lays it out on the table, gathers wings because she's able to become a bird. You can see the throne in front of her, flutters over his missing penis and becomes pregnant. And they produce a child named Heru, who the Greeks call Horus. The word Heru is where we get the word hero from. This is an immaculate conception. And the whole mission of Heru is to achieve his legacy and to avenge his father's murder. He grows up, they have many battles, in the process of which he loses his eye, which is what we call the eye of Heru, or the third eye. He finally is about to vanquish his uncle, Set. He has a javelin, he has his foot on his uncle's neck, or his chest, and he's about to plunge the javelin in his uncle's throat. And Aset, the most aggrieved one of all, with the exception of Asar, prevents that. She will not allow him to kill his uncle. And according to the tradition, Heru is so angry that he knocks his mother's head off and replaces it with the head of a cow. Eventually, he achieves his goal, he regains his legacy, and he becomes the king of the living, or the incarnation of the living king. Now, in that story, which I've just briefly paraphrased, you find most of the concepts of Christianity today. You have a virgin birth. You have an immaculate conception. You have a brother slaying another brother. You have divine compassion. All of these things, I could be wrong, but it seems to me that the most important aspect of any religion, including Christianity, is to talk about life everlasting. What's going to happen to you when you die? The Africans are the first people that I know of to talk about resurrection. That you can be born again, but only if you did righteous things. And we can find so many of the roots of Christianity in Africa. The 10 Commandments surely come from what are called the 42 admonitions of my eye. But we are taught that Christianity is a unique religion, that there are no parallels, and to question those concepts for many people is a form of blasphemy or sacrilege. And that was the way it was for me. I grew up in the church. I grew up in the Church of God in Christ. We danced, we shouted, we spoke in tongues. And by the time I became a teenager, I started asking questions. I'm thinking God gave me a brain, I should use it. And I began to ask, why are some people poor and others are not? Why do babies suffer? What have they done? And why are you driving that Cadillac, by the way, since I'm asking questions? And invariably the answer would be, don't question the will of God, that God works in mysterious ways. And finally, as I persisted, it would be best for you to find another church home. So you see, I'm very reluctant to bring these things up because we are taught not to question, just to accept, to have blind faith. And these things are deeply instilled in us. Now, after I left the church, I went through a phase of agnosticism where I doubted, and I went through a phase of complete atheism where I denied. I fiddled with Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam. Now, but those teachings are still deeply instilled in me. Now, my mother is an ancestor now who I love very much. Even now, I think about my mother every day, even though she's been an ancestor for years. Now, I don't know anybody who's been to heaven and come back and showed pictures and documented it. But it comforts me to think that my mother is in heaven, even though I have no empirical evidence of that. Several years ago, I had a medical emergency, and the doctor was saying, Dr. Rashidi, you might lose your left leg. It shook me up. I started reading the book of Job. I said, Jesus, you know I've been talking bad about you for a long time. But just in case you are out there, help a brother out. Now, when I got well again, I went back to my old ways. But I'm pointing out that even if we have evidence to the contrary, I think we do, those deeply instilled values don't go anywhere. They're in our minds. So that's a little bit about my perception of the Immaculate Conception. I hope that it makes sense.
Thank you. Thank you.
How are you? I think that your presentation is very enlightening. I'm curious, how many grammar schools and how many high schools do you speak to in the month of February?
In February, you mean 2017, just last month, or in general?
Last month we could use as an exemplary month.
I'm trying to think if I spoke in any public schools last month. I spoke in churches, I spoke in mosques, I spoke in universities, community centers, bookstores, but I'm not sure if I spoke, yeah, I did. But in this case, it was even a school for adult learners. So no, I didn't get to speak to any. I would if I was invited.
You won't get invited, that's what I was thinking, because it's not about educating African American children.
I get invited sometimes, just like I don't speak at a lot of churches, but I get invited to some. Because just like we have progressive pastors, we also have progressive teachers. Although everybody doesn't believe it, we have progressive police officers. We have progressive people in the military. There are people all over the world, just like you and me, with inquiring minds who want to see our people do better. And they're in all kinds of fields and capacities. I think a lot of the times we don't support them, though. So they find themselves very isolated and alone and pressured, and sometimes they give up. That's why I say all the time, we need to support brothers like this. And you need to support scholars like me. I have doubts. I sometimes think maybe I should have been like Henry Louis Gates. In other words, lie. Make white people feel guilty. Say black people are responsible for enslavement. say that there were no black Egyptians. I would imagine that all of us in our own ways sometimes have doubts and fears and question whether this commitment to African empowerment is worth the sacrifices that we make. You know how many relationships I've been in and didn't work out because I was traveling trying to save the world? That I didn't want to do the things that other people do? I would imagine that Harriet Tubman must have been afraid sometimes. That Dr. King must have been afraid sometimes and wondered, you know, think about this man whose life was threatened so many times, so many assassination attempts. And we forget sometimes that Malcolm and Martin were only in their 30s when they were taken away from us. So, I mean, these are normal things I think that any human would go through. So we have to support each other. Because a lot of times our biological families won't support each other. A lot of times our mates won't support us. So what we need is extended family. And that's what we have here today. People come out on a Sunday afternoon, taking time out of your busy schedules and decided this is what I want to do. Because you can't do it by yourself. I don't care how, that's one of the most important lessons I've learned in the struggle. And I've been doing this for 44 years now. You can't do it by yourself. And no matter how hard you try, you're not going to achieve it overnight. We have generations of struggle ahead of us, and we have to prepare ourselves for that. One or two more questions, maybe? Yes, sister.
Hello. As I told you before, I'm born and raised in Gary, Indiana, and I am here back in Indiana because I would like to run for governor here.
Wow.
But one of the things, like you mentioned, we don't support each other. A lot of these
We speak in German. Some of us do, but we don't do it enough.
Right. A lot of these organizations that are out here don't even support each other. So, and you spoke on something that I've been thinking that's somewhere where we need to start. And I want to hear what you have to say, even though you aren't a doctor of psychiatry or psychology, but it's more history and culture. You spoke on the rehabilitative process that people go through when they've gone through crisis or tragedy, that we didn't get the opportunity to go through, coming from slavery, coming from oppression, coming from the things that we've come from. And I noticed that a lot of people, because one thing that interested me when I was going to college was mental health. A lot of people suffer from PTSD and have never been to actual war, but we are at war. So what does that look like to you as far as rehabilitating us to come to this idea of being able to come together, to be able to organize, to be able to take on the legacy that we had before slavery? What does that mental health process, what does that rehabilitative process look like?
I think that for me, the most important thing is to have a kind of a support group. That's a big thing to me. Just having some, that's why I spend so much time on Facebook. It's not fully adequate, but just to have somebody to talk to and to share with and say, this is what I saw today. I saw a Black Madonna. You know, so that is really what's missing in my life in many ways. Just having somebody to share it with, because otherwise, I think you really will go crazy. So I would say that should be your #1 priority, to find a support group. If it's just one person or 2 or 3 people or whatever the case may be, so that you don't feel completely isolated and alone, because that'll drive you out of your mind. That'll drive you crazy. I think that's a very, very important first step, and I can't emphasize that enough. Maybe 1 or 2 more. Sister, I know you had, we'll make yours the last, because you can't see anything with the microphone.
When you,
Who's talking? All right, I can see you.
I was wondering, when you were talking about the noses and the faces,
Yeah.
I had read somewhere that the Pharaoh that talked about there being one God, that he was hated by his people to the point that they tried to scratch off everything that had his name on it. So that there would be, because if his name was not known, there would be no memory of him. And I was reading in National Geographic about the Nubian pharaohs. I don't know if you had saw that or not. I was intending to bring that book because I found it interesting. But with what the brother was saying about why were we chosen as slaves, I know the Europeans tried to use the scripture in the Bible about Noah cursing his son's child, Cush. But that came, it was Noah that cursed him, not God. The Europeans tried to say that God cursed Noah's son. So my question to you is, we as a people, what more can we do? I know one of the things I have done is I've gone to different African American historical sites, took pictures, brought them back here for children that don't have the money to go down there and see those sites. Because if they don't know their past, they can't improve their future. So what else do you feel we should do as a people to encourage this?
I think that at this point, we need to stop talking about what we should do as a people and start talking about what we should do directly ourselves. Because you really can't control what other people do. You really only have control as to what you do. So again, I go over the basics. I think that it's very important, in my opinion, for black men and black women to be together, to form strong units, and be that support group. That, to me, is number one. Spend money with other black people. Stop saying because you got service that you were dissatisfied with, that you're never going to do business with another black person as long as you live. Okay? A lot of us are like that. If you went to the restaurant and you ordered a meal and it was a little pricey or it took too long, I'm never going to go to another black-owned restaurant forever, ever. But I'm going to go to McDonald's and Applebee's and give them all my money. Because white people's ice is colder than black people's ice in the eyes of many of us. Join an organization. It can be this church. It can be an organization, another organization of like-minded people. Get an image of God that looks like you. Go to Africa if you can and just see it and touch it and feel it. Support the scholars. Buy one of my books so I can travel some more. No, I'm not trying to be funny. Donald Trump is not going to help me out. Bill Gates ain't going to send me a check. So I depend on you. Support the institutions that are already doing things. Support the activists that are trying to do things. Brother Kwabina's over there, he's got a program going on where he's trying to get essentially filth off the radio waves. So we stop using the B word and the N word like it's a term of endearment. So there's so many basic, fundamental things that we can do. I say over and over again that African liberation is not complicated. It's the application. That's the hard part. Because that means that we got to stop doing all the things we've been doing to support white supremacy. White supremacy cannot exist if we don't enable it to. But we're used to it. We're used to giving the system our money. We're used to making other things more important than African liberation. So that, for example, if we were having this program today and the Super Bowl was on, chances are this place would be empty. Now we say we want to be liberated, but the football game is more important than this discussion. So I'm talking about basic fundamentals. You know, look after one another again. Be my brother's keeper, my sister's keeper. So these are basic fundamental things that I think that we just aren't used to doing, because slavery took that away from us. Stop waiting for a Messiah or a Savior to save us from basic issues. I heard a long time ago, I don't know if it's in the Bible or not, God helps those who help themselves. Basic things like that. And by the way, the story of Africans being cursed, I don't think that's in the Bible. Maybe you can give me the chapter and the verse. I think that's from Talmudic scholars. Right. And that has been used to justify enslavement. Right. Read more. Put black art on your walls. I'm talking about basic fundamental things. Adopt a standard of beauty that is from your perspective and not those who have oppressed us. Do you know how much money we spend on hair care products? Do you know how much money we spend on sports shoes? Stop that. Be more selective in your spending. All these basic fundamental things that we could do to change our lives dramatically, but we won't do it because we're used to doing it. I gave you the example early on, and this is my big pet peeve right now, that black men need to be with black women. Stop saying it don't matter who I fall in love with, that I couldn't help who I fell in love with. We make choices. It's important that we come together as a unit. You can't talk about black people need to unite and then got a blonde on your arm. It's a contradiction. And we need to come together on that level. And perhaps the most important thing, or one of the most important things, I'm repeating myself now, is we just need to talk to each other a lot more. I've been told over and over again that the most important thing in any relationship is communication. Talk to each other. And don't feel like you have to have the last word. And you always have to be right. And it's my way or the highway. If we just communicate with each other, talk to each other with love and tolerance and patience, we can solve a lot of problems right there. And buy one of my books. That's another one. It's the last question.
Okay. It's my understanding that approximately 200 years after Alexander the Great conquered the Middle East in that area, there were these black people called the Maccabees, and they were kicking Greek butt. They were kicking Greek rear end and taking names. And these black brothers had gathered together an army, but they were really trying to protect their land. I was just wondering, do you have information on the Maccabees in either your books, or you have any visuals regarding these people?
Let me see if I can show you a picture. I'm having problems here, but it might work. Of the people that I like what you're talking about. Oh, maybe I can find one in here. Just bear with me for a moment. I put a lot of emphasis on these pictures because I come from the maxim that seeing is believing. And the images are very powerful. And I think that the more we see them, especially our children, the better it is.
That's why I asked the question, how many grammar schools and high schools are you getting to? Because these pictures give a strong self-image of who you are.
Then y'all need to invite me.
Greatest confusion.
Why don't the parents in these schools put pressure on the administration of these schools? I mean, I'll work with any budget. If need be, I'll do it for free. But somebody's got to take the initiative. I think that what we have a tendency to do is wait for somebody else to do it. That we become so psychologically dependent on other people that we seem to forget that we're the ones we've been waiting for. Now, this is a person from Judea, a town called Lachish. This is about 700 BC. And so I think this is typical of what a lot of people in that region would have looked like around that time. Okay. So the images are there, and images are very powerful. So even if you disagree with a lot of what I said today, I hope that the images that I presented will stay with you, and that we'll keep it going. Again, I want to thank Pastor Jackson for inviting me again.
Thank you.
I want to thank the church in general for supporting him, getting me here, being supportive year after year after year. We can do this thing. We can do this thing.
Somebody asked about the prices of the books.
Now, I have 4 books here. 3 of the books, including the newest one, the book on Europe, Egypt, with a lot of the photographs that you saw today. They're $40 each. The children's book is $20.
I need that.
You can use a credit card, a debit card, you can write a check, and cash is not a bad thing. So if you're interested, come on over, and I'd be happy to autograph it.
Put your hands together again for Dr. Runoko Rashidi. Come on up. Support his products.